Last week, we began a brand new sermon series on an incredible character in the Bible. What's his name? Anybody remember from last week? King David. Yes. Last week we began a focus on King David, and this first little mini series of his life we're calling When God Redefined Your Life. So this first little several weeks of his whole life, we'll cover his whole life this year, but the first little mini series we're calling When God Redefines Your Life. So that's the first little piece of his life, the first few chapters that we read. So last week, here's where we were if you missed us. We saw a nobody, the youngest of the family, the little brother nobody paid attention to. We saw that young man declared to be the next king of God's people. In an instant, God redefined his life. Samuel had come to Bethlehem, found David, and anointed him the next king. And if you were here, you know that the big change, the immediate difference when he was anointed was what? That the Spirit of the living God rushed upon his life. And many of you can testify to that fact, can you not? When the Holy Spirit comes into your life, when you're saved, everything changes. In that moment, in an instant, God is now with you in an intimate, emotional, and real way. A few months back at the end of our church service, we were standing up here and a young lady walked up to me and wanted me to pray with her, and she couldn't stop crying. God was moving so powerfully in her life that she was having a hard time even processing it all. It was an incredible moment. The Spirit was working in her life. And it was so awesome to see. And moments like that remind me indeed of what a redefining moment it is in our lives when we're saved and the Holy Spirit comes into our lives. Any amens to that? Anybody recognize? Yeah. So David's life was forever redefined. However, we also saw that a redefined life does not mean an easy life. In fact, outwardly, things don't always change right away. We saw that nothing much changed externally in David's situation. I mean, that whole king thing, remember that? The whole king thing? Well, David won't become king for like more than a decade. That's a long way off. And the point is this: there are highs and there are lows in life of the person who's devoted to God. And it's just helpful to know that, so you're not disappointed or think you're doing something wrong, right? Like highs and lows, they're a normal part of the life with God in a fallen world. I was talking to a guy in our small group, and we were lamenting together how tough the seasons of normal are. Anybody else just hate normal? It's like, normal. But here's the deal. The highs, the lows, the average. These are all seasons God uses to grow us. And so this week and next week, we're gonna see David experience an intense high moment. That's this week. And then an intense low moment next week. When God redefines your life, there will be both. Now here's the good news for us today. Today, we'll see the high moment. It's a good day, right? So skip church next Sunday. No, I'm just joking. Come back. But listen, today's the good stuff. Today is a high moment. So anybody ready to read about one of the greatest stories in all the Bible? Anybody? I tell you what, I cannot wait. Now, if you cheated and you read ahead, you know that today we're talking about David and Goliath. Bunch of cheaters, you already knew that, right? Good for you, good for you. So I can't wait. Well, if you brought a Bible, open it up to the book of 1 Samuel again, 9th book of the Bible, 1 Samuel. Today we're in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So turn there or flip there. If you have a Bible with you, 1 Samuel 17. My earliest memory of the great David and Goliath story, I was thinking about this, was when I was 4 or 5 years old. My grandmother had bought me this book filled with Bible stories. I can still picture the cover to this day. And on the front of the cover was David and Goliath. That was one of the pictures. And we'd lay on the bed together and read the stories together. And sure enough, this famous story was contained therein. I loved it. Let me say this. So often what I have found is that we don't understand the true lesson of the story. So often we think the idea, if you know the David and Goliath story, so often we think the idea is something like this, that we all face Goliaths in our lives, fear, worry, addiction, whatever. And we can defeat those giants by being like David. Maybe you've heard something like that. And at the end today, I'm going to make the case that as powerful as that idea is, there is even a deeper meaning to the story, which I'm betting is going to surprise many of you. So I have lots to get to today, so let's dive into the story and see what happens. Maybe this is your first time in a context like this or online, and you don't even know the David and Goliath story. Well, let me tell you, you're in for a treat today. It's an incredible story. So here's how it starts in verse 1. 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. So here we have David's first big test, the Philistines. Now, if you remember back when Saul was anointed king, he was tested against the evil Ammonites 6 chapters earlier in 1 Samuel 11. And now we're going to see today, David, the newly anointed, will be tested. Every time God gives you more influence, listen to this, every time God gives you more leadership, you will face tests. God tests and God tries his leaders to grow them. So, who are the Philistines? Well, you need to know the Philistines, they're the bad guys in the story. They're an evil people. They were neighbors to the Israelites to the west. They lived along the Mediterranean coast, and they were very sexually deviant as a people, including acts of prostitution in worship. Awful. They were a warring people. They were aggressive. Now, did you notice that this battle was in Soko, which was not a neutral site? Who did it belong to? Tell me. It belonged to Judah, to Israel, which means the Philistines were invading, aggressive, and evil. Look at verse 2. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. So you got a picture, King Saul, all the soldiers of Israel gathered together. They're preparing for battle. Verse 3, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So you've got this ominous gathering of enemies, right? Each gathered on either side of a valley. The Philistines on one side of the valley, and God's people on the other side. It's the perfect setting for the perfect conflict. Don't you just, come on guys, don't you just love those war movies, right? It's like, let's go, oh, it's perfect. This is the good stuff. But something unexpected happens in verse 4. Now, I don't know about you, but when hundreds and even thousands of soldiers are lined up, what do you expect to happen? Here's what I expect to happen. I expect somebody to scream, charge, and then they all take off toward each other like the movies. But there's something else in play here, something unexpected. Check it out, verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So from the Philistine army and the countless number of soldiers, a huge warrior steps out, a mighty and intimidating soldier. This, friends, is Goliath. Now it says he was a champion. Now that word champion in the original Hebrew, it doesn't mean champion. It means an in-between man. That's what it says. He was an in-between man in the Hebrew language. The King James in 1611 translated it champion, and almost every other translation just sort of copied it. But it literally means an in-between man. So there came out from Goliath an in-between man named Goliath. The idea could mean a couple things. Maybe it means that Goliath looked something like in between a man and a god. Maybe something like that. Or it could simply be referring to the idea that he was standing in between the two armies. But this in-between man was huge. Now you need to know this. There's actually some debate as to exactly how tall he was. So some manuscripts say 6 cubits in a span. Other manuscripts say 4 cubits in a span. And you're like, well, that's very helpful. Thank you, Jason, for that, right? But it's hard to tell. It's a little bit divided hard to be certain as to which is the original reading. But here's what you need to know, if you don't already know this. A cubit was about 18 inches, 1.5 feet. And a span was about half of that, so about 9 inches. So either Goliath was just short of 10 feet tall, or he was just short of 7 feet tall, depending. Now keep in mind, either 10 feet or 7 feet. Keep in mind the average height of the Middle Eastern men in those days was about 5.5 feet tall, according to archaeological records. So either way, 10 feet, 7 feet, either way, guess what? Goliath was huge and formidable. And let's be honest, scary, right? He's just scary. I mean, he had a helmet of bronze on his head. I've never had one of those. Maybe you have, right? He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. So get this, he wore helmet of bronze armor, coat of armor weighing about 125 pounds, what this would have been. So the word mail, that's something like scales of bronze. Maybe you've seen those kinds of armor, sort of look like the scales of a snake almost. Just to picture that. And that coat again, remember, 125 pounds. Look at verse 6. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. Now, are you picturing this? This is not just some kind of fairy tale, people. This is real. Picture this. This is real. Armor covering his legs so you couldn't chop his legs with your sword. You couldn't kick him in the shin, right? It would have hurt. So you can't do that kind of stuff. He had a javelin that he sort of wore like a backpack or like a bow and arrow over his back. I have to admit, the javelin always makes me nervous at track meets. Anybody with me on that? I don't know why, but I'm always terrified if I'm at a track meet that some kid's gonna be walking out in the field and get impaled with a hurling javelin. Those things are terrifying. But that's not all. Look at verse 7. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. So get this, the head of his spear, this is 15 pounds. Now a spear is meant to be lightweight, so you can move it fast. But just the tip of the spear alone was 15 pounds. And as if all that wasn't enough, this is what gets me most. In addition to all that weaponry, Goliath also had a shield bearer, like a guy who walked in front of him holding the shield. This is not fair, friends. Again, in other words, this is scary. That's how he looked. This is ominous to even picture. And what he said even made things worse. Look down at verse 10. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. So you got to picture it. This monster is defying the armies of the people of God. He's taunting the people with unparalleled disrespect. I mean, this whole thing is terrifying. It's humiliating and it's embarrassing to be honest. But there's good news. King Saul has been through this before. He's had his fair share of victories. So surely Saul will be brave and come through. Well, let's see. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. I mean, ugh. This is so disappointing. Like last time this happened with the Ammonites, Saul handled it. The Spirit of God was with him, but not this time. Now he bows in fear. The Spirit of God has left him, we learned last week, and he's now puny and weak. It's embarrassing, to be frank. Over and over again, there's a lesson here. Over and over again, we got to get this lesson. Over and over, the lesson is not learned, is it? The lesson is this: do not consider the appearance of a person. Man looks at the outer appearance, but God looks where? At the heart. It's like Samuel. You're impressed with Saul because he looks kingly. Samuel, you're impressed with Eliab. This is all from last week because he looks mighty. And now it's Saul. You're terrified of Goliath because he looks formidable. And in this moment, the reader of the story is left crying out for somebody, just somebody, anybody who will stop looking at the appearance and start seeing the way God sees. Will anybody have the proper perspective here? Will you have the proper perspective in your life? Will anybody realize that human strength and outer ability are nothing compared to the power and the might of the living God? Well, enter David. Look down in verse 20. It says this in verse 20. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. So, as it turned out, David's oldest 3 brothers were in the army. And so they were living on the battlefront. So Jesse, the dad, had told David to take bread and cheese to his brothers and some of the commanders, and so David did. Now keep in mind how humble this young man's beginnings start out. He's not even worthy of the army. He's too young. He's not big enough. He's not strong enough. And so you know what he's been reduced to? A DoorDash roll, right? I mean, he's like the grab and go guy. I was in the McDonald's drive-thru the other day and I looked in and it said they have a whole shelf devoted to the grab and go DoorDash people. That's David, right? I mean, really? Can you even imagine? It's like, sure, Dad, I'll take the bread and cheese to the soldiers. That won't be embarrassing. But it just so happened that he arrived right as everybody was lining up at the battle line. He leaves his stuff with somebody else and he runs around to find his brothers. I mean, you can imagine the chaos of the moment. Everyone's half excited, half terrified, crazy everywhere. But he finds them. He finds Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. And here it is in verse 23. And as he talked with his brothers, behold, the in-between one, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. Now, I just love this. So Goliath starts his hideous rant. Everybody's terrified, cowering in fear. But then David heard him. I mean, you can picture David. This is sort of the way I see it, like in a little movie kind of thing, turning his head slowly like, what'd that man say? You know what I'm talking about? Like that kind of thing, you know? He's like, that's not okay. That's not okay with me. Look at verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God. And this is truly amazing. David, not a warrior at all in the traditional sense of the word. David sees through all the fog and he sees the truth. He sees the fact this is a dirty, rotten, sin-saturated, pride-filled, uncircumcised enemy of God. Who in the world does he think he is, taunting the armies of the God of heaven and earth? Doesn't he know any better? Who was his mama anyway, right? Didn't she teach him any better than that? Doesn't he know not to mess with the living God? Now look at verse 28, interesting. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And his oldest brother said, why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Now I just love this. In the middle of the chaos, Eliab overhears the talk from his little runt brother. And he's ticked. You know what he's got, don't you? Like, he's got older brother syndrome. That's what that is. The original Hebrew, I love it, says the anger of Eliab became hot. I love that, right? The anger of Eliab became hot. So Eliab's really upset. And he's even insulting, right? He's like, those few sheep. That's just like, that's sarcastic. That's like a hit below the belt. That's low. But look what it says. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? I mean, they've been through this before, you can tell, right? Growing up. And he turned away from him. David turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. Now, I heard a pastor make a point about this that I thought was so powerful. Get this. David picked the right battle. He chose the right battle, and it was not with his older brother. He turned away from his brother's anger and moved on. If he had chosen to fight with Eliab, it would have been for what? For the sake of pride. Friends, pride is always the wrong battle. Know that. You never want to fight for your pride. But David moved on. He moved on. And soon enough, all of David's words reached eventually to the ears of Saul himself. And so Saul sends for him. Verse 32. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, king. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. David's like, oh, king, let nobody be afraid today. I'll go. I will go and fight this pathetic, godless giant. And Saul's like, well, oh, goody. Now we're all saved, right? We'll send out our little DoorDash driver to get slaughtered. And don't forget, by the way, if we lose, we're all going to be slaves. But look what David said, verse 33. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go out against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth. And he's been a man of war from his youth. Saul's like, no can do, little man. It's not going to happen. Thanks, but no thanks. You don't got what it takes. But David persisted. He keeps talking, making his case. Here's what he says. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. David's like, I have battle experience, thank you very much, out in the fields while watching the sheep. We read this now and it sort of stretches our imagination, doesn't it? It's like really? Like he fought lions and bears? But don't forget, the Spirit of the Lord is now upon his life. This is most definitely not out of the question. This is how the Spirit has been preparing David. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So David convinces Saul that to give him the green light. And you know how the story goes. Saul puts all this armor on him, but David can hardly even walk in it. Remember the story? David's like, nope, thanks for that, but can't do it this way, can't do it with all the armor. Here was the plan. Look at verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones. You ready for this? From the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now I want you to notice something about this. This is like play by play. This attention to detail. Don't let this don't miss this. This slowdown is meant to help us feel the weight of this moment. This is so out of the ordinary in Old Testament writing style. The typical Old Testament Hebrew writing style is to fly through things. Just give an overview. Just give the highlights and move on. Like think back to Genesis 1. The first day God said, let there be light, and there was light. What? Can you give us the details? It keeps second day. Third day, there was vegetation. 5th day, sea creatures. It's like slow down, fill us in. What happened, right? Oh, by the way, the 6th day, we get land creatures, humans, next, on and on. That's sort of the typical Hebrew style. But the narrative here comes to a screeching halt. The level of detail is meant to help us feel this moment. So here it is. David took his staff in his hand and chose stones from the brook and put them in his pouch. His sling was in his hand. He walked toward Goliath on and on and on. It's slow down. And as he approaches Goliath, the giant spews nasty, degrading words at David. He cursed David, more like a snaky monster than a human, probably by looks. But look at David's response. So here's David's famous speech. And take note, this is awesome. The speech is longer than the fight. These are some of the best words in the entire Bible. This is the good stuff right here. I'm gonna read his speech to you without comment and just let you enjoy it. This is verses 45, 46, and 47, and it's awesome. Here's what he says. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword, not with spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Whew, that gives me chills. In fact, let's just stop and give God some praise for those words. Come on. Whew. I mean, finally, somebody who gets it. Finally, someone who realizes that the outer appearance, the outer strength, it's irrelevant compared to a mighty God. The battle, every battle for that matter, is the Lord's. And the Lord is always mighty to save. So what's going to happen? Well, here it is. Look at verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. No fear, no second thoughts. Is David walking or is David running? Which is it? David ran. Verse 49, and David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Now these slings, these stones, Studies have been done on these ancient weapons of war. Maybe you've seen this. We're told that stones like this would have been released traveling nearly 100 miles per hour. And we're also told these stones, they would have probably been around the size of an orange. So you can picture that. And all sorts of modern experiments have been done to replicate this moment. Not with a real head, by the way, right? But maybe you've seen those shows on that sort of do different physics experiments or different kinds of tests on TV. But studies demonstrate how vicious such a hit could have been. So Goliath wouldn't have even seen it coming. It was coming so fast. But the stone sank into his forehead and he was dead. Verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Don't you just love that? You see the point, right? Like God did it. God is the hero. God gave David the victory. God did the work. Just like David knew God would do. Victory comes from the Lord. But I've got good news for you grisly, awesome gore lovers. This thing's not done yet. This battle has not yet been gory enough. Look at verse 51. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword. If you're below 5th grade in the room, close your ears right now. And drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So David runs over, takes the sword from the side of Goliath, Goliath's own sword, and cuts off the head of this monster. And it becomes clear to everyone, God wins. That the Lord of heaven and earth wins every battle. Friends, this battle is officially over. There is so much in this story, so many allusions to other scriptures. It's awesome to see. Maybe you remember Genesis 3:15, a very important verse where God is pronouncing judgment on Adam and Eve and the serpent. Remember Genesis chapter 3, the fall? God tells the snake, you, O serpent, you will strike the heel of the hero one day, but he's gonna crush your head. Goliath wore that scaly armor. I picture him looking more like a snaky monster than a human. But David, the anointed one, crushed his head. And David held the head of the giant in victory. That, my friends, is the story of David and Goliath. So, what does this incredible story mean for us? Like, what do we take from this? How does this narrative help us on Monday? It's so easy to miss the main point if we're not careful. So easy. Maybe you've noticed that it's like we're wired, all of us, we're wired, we're programmed to see ourselves in the main character of a book or a story or a movie. You ever thought about that? Like there's something in us. You read a book, you watch a show, you hear a story. There's something in us that naturally assumes the point of view of the hero or the main person. And so one way this story gets taught much of the time is something like this. Be like David. Do what David did. Slay the giants in your life. Like, what are you facing? Oh, is fear your Goliath, or is worry the giant that is staring you down? Maybe you got an addiction that's become a Goliath in your life. Solution, be like David. Slay the giant. You can do it. But friends, I'm telling you, there is a problem with that if you stop there. Here's the problem. Most of the time, it simply doesn't work. Most of the time, we're simply not good enough. We're not brave enough. We're not strong enough to slay our own giants. Not the real ones, not the real giants in our lives, the deep ones. The real giants in our lives, those things that are deeply personal, intensely frightening, we cower away in fear. So here's the truth. This is what I want you to get today. We're not David in this story. We're the Israelites. We're the guys on the sidelines, terrified as we see Goliath and hear his accusations and attacks. We're not like David. We're like Israel. And get this, we need a David. That's the key. Do you see it? We need a David to fight for us. We need a go-between. We need an in-between man. We need a go-between to defeat the other in-between man. We need an anointed one, so filled with the Spirit, so filled with the power of God, who can defeat evil and overcome the enemies in our own lives. And this is Christianity. This is what Jesus Christ does for us. Christianity is not just a pep talk. It's not just a pep rally or a motivational message. It's not things like this. Just believe in yourself. You can do it. Just be true to who you are. You've heard those things, right? Like every day. How about this one? Just be the good person that you really are deep down. Just do better. Just be better. Listen, if you're new today, if you're new to all this may be shocking to you. Maybe this is a new thing, but listen to this. That's not Christianity. Christianity is this. We were too weak and scared to help ourselves. We were desperate for a king and a mighty warrior to come fight for us. And I'm telling you, that is exactly what God gave us in Jesus Christ. Anybody knows that? Can I just get a huge amen? Come on. This is the gospel, Trinity. It's the gospel. This is the gospel, the message that we're proclaiming, that Jesus Christ is the new and better David. He is the son of David, and he has fought for us. Jesus has slayed our Goliath for us. So get this, David took the place of the Israelite army, and Jesus takes the place of everybody who believes in him. David had zero fear as he stared Goliath down, and Jesus had zero fear as he stared death itself in the face. David was humble and yet mighty in character, and so too Jesus was humble and meek and yet mighty and powerful. God rescued David from death, and God handed Jesus over to death so that we could be rescued. I'm gonna keep going, listen to this. David fought a human giant for his people. Jesus fought sin and death for his people. David delivered his people from Goliath, and Jesus delivered his people from sin and darkness. Do you see the point? The point of the story is not that we are David. The point of the story is that we needed a David. And God gave us the perfect David, Jesus Christ. And that makes all the difference, I'm telling you. So, what do we do then? If that's the case, well then what do we do about it? What can we do this week to win our battles? So here's what you do. When you wake up tomorrow and it's the dreaded day, the M day, Monday, here's what you do. You keep your eyes on the King and follow his lead into the battle. The giants in your life are real. The giants in our lives, they have to be defeated. We really do have our own Goliaths. That's true. I mean, maybe this week, you know God wants you to tell your friend at school about God and to invite him to church, and you're terrified. Maybe that's it for you. Maybe this week, You have an intense fear of some doctor appointment or some health issue, and fear is causing you to lose faith. Or maybe it's something like this. Maybe you have a secret addiction issue that nobody knows except you and God. And what are you gonna do about it? Well, here's what you're gonna do. I love this out of Hebrews chapter 12. This is it right here. You're gonna do this. You better get ready. This is awesome. 3 verses from Hebrews 12, listen to it. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and run the race set before us, looking to Jesus. See that? Looking to Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, defeated his Goliath, and is seated at the right hand of God. Consider him, verse 3 of Hebrews 12, consider him who endured such hostility. Think about him, keep your eyes on him, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So there it is. You keep your eye on the king this week. If you're a soldier and you love your king and you see your king leading the way, you know what you're gonna do? You're gonna follow him anywhere, aren't you? You're gonna follow his lead and trust him. You're gonna follow into the battle, and friends, get this, Goliath will fall. So the question is this: would you trust him today? Jesus, the Son of David, can be yours right now. You don't have to continue to fight this life on your own. You don't have to continue that. You don't have to continue fighting Goliath on your own. You don't have a shot. But your king can do it. And Jesus is here. And Jesus is yours if you will only have him. So would you trust him today?